outside of, oh, Leonardo da Vinci fell off. This was live. Hello and welcome to Exhibitionistas, Notes on Arts. I'm your host, Joana P. Neves, and this is your Art Wonderment podcast. In a fortnight, we will go back to the regular program. And so this is the last one of my special episodes. I am going to explain what is wonderment, first and foremost. Then I'm going to introduce two new segments called Art Etiquette and Brainstorm in a Teacup. More on that later. I'm also going to answer a question that I'm going to ask right now. Is digital media cutting us off from culture? Finally, I'm going to tell you how you can benefit from Exhibitionistas' live events, workshops, and art space in London, if you're in London. But those events over there, some of them will have online versions that you can participate in. I use the word wonderment, so this is the first thing I wanted to talk about today, the notion of wonderment. You know those animal, bird and game whistles that you blow into? Some of them produce big noises, others like a really subliminal noise that you can't really hear, but the animals will hear. It's kind of like that for my fellow friends, my sisters, my brothers, my non-binary siblings who love words as much as I do. It's also because that word, wonderment, it is fair to say, produces a sort of a double take. It is not wandering, so W-A is spelled W-O-N-D, so wonderment, and you don't quite know what it is. You presume it's close to wandering, and it's not. So the Cambridge Dictionary defines wonderment as, quote, a feeling of great surprise and admiration caused by seeing or experiencing something that is strange and new. Isn't that precisely what happens when you experience art, when you go and see an exhibition, for example? You know, if all goes well, obviously. There is always an element of discovery. And listen, I love words, and I really love the flexibility of etymology, because sometimes meanings travel, but it doesn't mean that they will travel in a mathematical exponential way. They can't be really traced in a sort of linear progression. It is really interesting to see that language kind of replicates our displacements and our contradictions as well. And so wonder, and wonder, there's a real overlap. The meaning of these two words plays off each other. So wandering means to roam about without a specific aim, and wonder is to be open to a surprise, is to be in admiration, even perhaps in awe, and even to marvel at something. And of course, when we think about wandering, we think about this openness of spirit to discovery and to even brave difficulty to get to a place that might be worth it, despite the hurdles to get there. So there's a real overlap. And I learned while researching these two words that there's a linguistic phenomenon, which is that similar words in language, either through sound, spelling, or both, start sharing their meanings through confusion. And I love this phenomenon because as much as we try to explain something, and this is something I, as a curator, usually tell artists who seek feedback, who seek some sort of advice regarding the way they present themselves and regarding the way they introduce their work. And I always say this: don't explain the work. The pleasure of conversing and of doing something that the Mexicans say platicar. So the word practice can translate as practicar with an R, P-R, but you can also say platicar, P-L. And platicar is the art of conversation without a particular goal in sight. It's a sort of expertise, but that relies mostly on intuition and guts and reactivity and listening to what the others are saying. You may be misunderstood. Someone else may be going on a different journey throughout the act of platicar, but they're getting somewhere. And it doesn't matter if they're wrong, if they're right, if they misunderstood something. The goal, when there is no goal, is to carve your own path into that experience and to somehow find yourself in it. Take this little voyage into sort of a visceral relationship with words as an example of the wonderment that you find in your Art Wonderment podcast, the granular experience of things, because that's what you can do in these digital platforms. You don't explain, you don't substitute the experience of actually being in the presence of an artwork. The next episode is going to be precisely about that through the reading of Walter Benjamin's seminal book titled The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. I hate this title. I always hesitate when I say it, but it's not written on my notes. I nailed it. I'm happy. Anyway, moving on. So another thing that I've experienced while fine-tuning in the background the episodes is something that I thought was completely nuts, that no one would enjoy, that I was the only one who found important, which is reading out loud. There's a sort of magic in that. One of the things that I thought about was reading Agnes Martin's diaries, texts, writings a long, long time ago, and discovering through her a Wordsworth poem. So she was a painter who lived in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, a very big, big reference for particularly minimalist and even conceptual artists of the 60s and 70s who moved to New Mexico. Her life is incredible, and I'm sure we'll dedicate a whole episode one day to her. I discovered, because I didn't grow up here in the UK, so there's a lot of things that I don't know that are incredibly familiar, obviously, to the Brits, perhaps even to Anglophones across the globe. But I didn't know that poem, which is quite a famous one. And in Wordsworth, there's the word, of course, or words, plural. The poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. But first I'm going to tell you why Agnes Martin loved it so much. It has to do with wonderment, obviously. So she goes on to say that for her, the importance of the experience is, and the joy found in experience, is to recall, quote, "To recall in one's mind past concrete experience is not circling. It is so much easier to respond accurately when alone. Experiences recalled are generally more satisfying and enlightening than the original experience. It is in fact the only way to know one's whole response. To illustrate recall, I will quote Wordsworth on having seen daffodils." And this is the poem that a lot of you will know, but I just want to read it because it's such a joyful poem. "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet cannot but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Agnes Martin says, responding with joy is the path, and we should work and eat with joy. The joy counts, and nothing else does. There is in reality no need for self-sacrifice and no call for it. Do not settle for the experience of others. If you follow others, you're in reality at a standstill, because their experience is in the past. That is circling. Even following your own past experience is circling. Know your own response to your own work and to the work of others. To recall in one's own mind past concrete experience is not circling. It is so much easier to respond accurately when alone. Experiences recalled are generally more satisfying and enlightening than the original experience. It is in fact the only way to know one's whole response. And later, the straightforward path, as we so often have been warned, is extremely hard to maintain. Only joyful discoveries count. If you're not making them, you are not moving. Now let us turn to abstract response, the response that we make in our minds free from concrete environment. We know that it prevails. We know that it is infinite, dimensionless, without form and void. But it is not nothing, because when we give our minds to it, we are blissfully aware. Being without imperfection, it is perfection. And being without parts, it is whole. It is from our awareness of transcendent reality and our response to concrete reality that our minds command us on our way, not really on a path or to a gate, but to full response. Complete consciousness is present to us at all times, every moment, but we reject it in order to maintain our prejudices, our ideas. But sooner or later, we will relinquish our ideas in favor of response, because the truth prevails. In the meantime, we can see ourselves in our own work. We can see ourselves moving along. We can see the steps we take. We can see that there is no such thing as going backward. We can be contented. We can know every day that we must do what we must do, and we will have plenty of energy with which to do it. We will know when it is something we want, and we will know when it is something that we do not want. One is tempted to say that the real experience of the daffodils is the second one, but I prefer to think that they are complementary and they are a sort of a continuum. It's through repetition, rereading, or recalling that things get really embodied in us, is by revisiting them. But what I like about Agnes Martin's text is that it doesn't instrumentalize the artistic experience. It talks about joy and the powers of joy, much more than happiness. But experiencing joy is something much more profound. It's an almost sacred kind of feeling, emotion. It takes hold of the whole body and it carries you and it lifts you up. The experience of joy is something that happens across time. This is really important. I want to talk about the fact that the experience, so the openness, the encounter with the artwork in the presence of the artwork is varied, and it can also happen through an image, through hearsay, someone talking about their experience. Is that something that you can't consider to be an aesthetic experience? To where and to what can be reduced the aesthetic experience, the creative encounter? There is something called Ekphrasis, and to be very honest with you, that's what I wanted to call the podcast, but then no one, absolutely no one, would listen to it. I don't know, I have a thing for unpronounceable words, probably, because Exhibitionistas is a tongue twister. Ekphrasis is a Greek word, and it denotes, designates an artwork that is fictional, but that nevertheless exists in the culture. So this was first applied to ancient poetry, and then it extended to any form of fictional writing. Think about the famous portrait in the Oscar Wilde book, Picture of Dorian Gray. You've never seen that portrait, and yet every one of us has imagined, or at least possesses, the idea of that portrait. So to what extent are aesthetic experiences bound to being in the presence of the artwork itself or having a direct connection to the artwork? We will talk about that in the next episode with the help of German theorist Walter Benjamin, who you probably know, and his very famous book. So now moving on to the second thing I wanted to introduce, the second idea that I wanted to introduce to you, which is the structure of the episodes. So consider these episodes like a garden. When you arrive, you need to see a sort of a solid path that you can follow calmly and just give in to the beauties of the landscape. So you need a sort of a fence that opens up. That is going to be the question. So I will start every episode with a question, which is probably very often going to be the title of the episode. Those questions will come from my work as a curator and also as someone who is directing and programming a space, a nonprofit in London called Welding. So over there, I will start doing some workshops that will also happen online. If you want to join, I will talk about them. It also provides a possibility of experiencing welding in other forms, particularly through the podcast. If you're in London, also, conversely, you have the possibility of extending your Exhibitionistas experience either through my writings on Substack or by going to our events, activities, open door events, concerts, workshops, talks, performances, etc. So that's for the question. We are arriving to the second segment that I wanted to introduce, which is art etiquette. I have done an episode called Art Etiquette. It's not quite the same thing. Apologies for the confusion, but I do love this title. And I don't know if you have followed the podcast since the beginning or if you're new here, but the first season was a very simple format. My friend Emily and I would visit an exhibition and then would discuss it from the prism of someone who is not at all in the contemporary art industry, and from my own prism, which is sort of the prism of the specialist, of the expert. And we had really interesting conversations. And I miss the ability of bringing other perspectives and other voices into the podcast. Voices of people who are not particularly in the art field or who are in the contemporary art field, but from a completely different kind of work and therefore a completely different angle. I really love it to be a sort of a Socratic exercise where I'm not here lecturing anyone. I love to know where the question comes from, why that question particularly, and then explore their own relationship with contemporary art or lack thereof. That said, art etiquette is going to be a very short segment, 10 minutes only. But I will keep the whole conversation accessible as a bonus. Too many goodies out there that don't make it to the episodes, and why not allow you to support the podcast with something extra for your own pleasure. That's it for art etiquette. Finally, last thing at the end of each episode, so you always have something to look forward to, you have Brainstorm in a Teacup, which is where I read an unrelated thought that I pluck out of probably the notebooks of the week, but I can go back. I have so many. It's going to be an honest thought that I find important enough to share, but too weird to turn into an episode, most likely. So there you go. That's the structure of the episode. And now we are going to move on to what I want to call digital hygiene. And I have it here on my notes, and I almost said dental hygiene. No. Digital hygiene, responding specifically to the question, is the digital media environment that we live in, cutting us off from culture. We live in a world that considers everything to be potentially quantifiable. So fandom, for example, is based on how many people an actor who has a big fan base can drive to cinemas. Culture seems, for the most part, to be out of that. We don't deal with great quantities. We don't go worldwide viral. And I wrote an article stating that a while ago, but also noticing how some artists can go viral. And that weirdly proved my point. I got a message saying that I was a parasite of society and deserved to die because I curate contemporary art performances. And so I reached out to these artists, and that's when I knew what was going on. Snoop Dogg put in one of his stories one of those performances. In a sense, whether these performances are going viral on Instagram or not, it doesn't really touch our own cultural field. Anyway, to my earlier point, and despite this little anecdote, I do think it is unuseful to think about the internet, including AI, as having everything in them. Perhaps that might be one of the reasons why it's not getting to you. Still, there's a lot on digital platforms anyway. And so in theory, culture should reach us, right? When we talk about digital media, we're talking about screens. They have become the maligned element that is destroying humanity through virtual platforms, spaces, and, ultimately lives. I see people in transport, reading the news, listening to a podcast, chatting via video WhatsApp, group chats, watching comedy clips. I mean, nothing really horrifying, really. But what are screens? So, a screen used to be a piece of furniture that protected us from the fire. That term came from the Middle Dutch scherm, which meant to cover, to shield, so protection. A screen would somehow symbolically or physically protect. It still meant the same thing when it started denoting the divider, so this piece of furniture that conceals a space. In 1810, it became a flat surface to receive projected images. This is in reference to lantern shows, so, a play of light and shadow. And then finally, in 1946, it was extended to the TV set and later on to the computer monitor. So tech turned the screen into a receiver and a diffuser of information, much like a canvas before it, if you think about it. The Proto-Indo-European origin of the word means to cut. And that made me think of a text by Hollis Frampton that makes a sort of a parallel between photography and the butcher. Of course, here we're talking about computers, probably moving image, but anyway, photography is a recording technique. It's the first recording technique that led to the creation of cinema. And so the butcher, using a knife, cuts, so reduces a raw carcass, he says, to edible meat. He does not make the meat, he makes the cuts, so dimensionless entities, as he calls them. Quote, "The photographic act is a complex cut in space and time, dimensionless in itself as the intersections and figures in Euclid's Elements, and in the mind, precisely as real, so as real as geometry. Geometry being a sort of an abstract language to cut and organize reality, but also to build stuff from that language." That's the conundrum, right? At the end, he says, the visitor, so this person who takes the photograph, thereby makes his own cliches that were at one time Vista's newly decreed imaginary lines laid out in projective space by the first photographers who saw them, acts of making more durable than stone and nearer to geomancy than bricklaying. This means that the photography is durable, not the object in itself, but that landmark. And therefore, media carries the culture. But unlike the butcher that actually really cuts the carcass and turns it into something edible and digestible that therefore disappears, each time we consume the image, unlike these cuts, the butcher's meat, this information that lands on our screens creates an objective, dynamic network of realities. Screens nowadays, they're a piece of furniture. They bear the memory of those lantern shows, of this play of shadow and light. It is said in Pliny the Elder's fragments of his big natural history book that it is very well known that the origin of drawing, of painting, is a woman drawing the shadow, the projected shadow of her departing lover onto a wall. If we consider that these screens are this kind of furniture that bears that memory, there is something also a bit sexy about them. So they reveal as much as they conceal, because the interesting idea of the origin of art being an outline of a shadow of someone real is that it is a trace of something that really happened. So there's a recording device in some way. So art as a recording device. And at the end of this text, Hollis Frampton says, through such acts endlessly renewed, so taking photos, we have learned to recognize all the appearances of the world. Through such acts, from its very beginnings, photography reasserts art's most ancient and permanent function, the didactic. Not only recording, but through this recording, transmission. But there's also something which is, if it's a piece of furniture, it means that, at least in theory, it is accessible, it is for everyone, it is democratic. So everyone, through screens, can have access to the same art piece. If anything, media creates culture. Screens, in terms of technology, in terms of this democratic use of them, have somewhat upset the hierarchy of the author and the creator, then the medium, the technology that diffuses or that bears the work, and the spectator / professional critic. But still, we maintain the same structure, which is the artist makes, the critic reviews, and the critic ultimately will look at the work through the binary of good or bad. So as soon as a visual artist enters the public sphere and the public space, the reaction was to say whether it was good or not, because that's the language that we projected out there. Many art critics have been fired from many important newspapers in the US, for example, in the UK. I will be very candid here. I don't read a lot of reviews. If I've seen an exhibition, I want to read what an interesting scholar, academic, writer, independent podcaster has to say about the exhibition in terms of whatever they researched about the artist or the topic, whatever they felt when they went there. Not really interested in knowing whether it's deserving art or not. There have been so many mistakes in art history. I think that should humble us and establish parameters of evaluation of our own relationship to things and what it is that creates an artistic object that is worth calling it such, and questioning the way it holds and whatever relationship it creates with you is what personally excites me. What do you see on your screens? I asked myself that question. At a certain point, the iPhone would send you how long you'd stayed on, you'd use the screen, the length of time. So again, this idea of quantifiable things, or the quantity of time, doesn't measure impact. You can see the love of your life for a quick lunch, and the impact won't be the same as the time you spend with your hated colleagues in the office space that you share with them, even though you spend the best of 5, 6, 7, 8 hours with them a day or a week. So that relationship between impact, value, and time is not what we think it is, basically. So maybe the best thing I thought was to look at how I was using screens. So basically, I write, I record, and I edit on screens, but that's because I'm a writer and a show creator. But one of the things that I noticed when I was sort of measuring the time that I spend editing, recording, scripting, writing my texts on my computer, I noticed that if I am invited to do a conference or to participate in a panel discussion, I will not be introduced as a podcaster. I will be introduced as an art critic and a curator, because that activity isn't contemplated as a valid professional role. But then I started to think, look at Katie Hessel. So Katie Hessel in the UK, but also worldwide, is pretty established. She's always in the charts of the most listened to art podcasts or book podcasts. So she started with an Instagram account, moved on to a podcast, which is called Great Women Artists Podcast. And it taps into a very easy consumable thing, which is the feminist trend. She doesn't stray that much from what gets the program into the culture. Artists being interviewed is really, you can find the most in any media, digital media out there when you're looking for contemporary arts. So Katie Hessel is now a personality of culture and visual arts culture in the UK. She is invited for cultural events everywhere. If you go onto her website, she was just at the Hay Festival interviewed by David Olusoga, who's an important established historian, about her last book, which the less said about it, the better. How did she obtain that? She published books that present a sort of archival list of maybe overlooked artists, but it's not critical thinking. She picked a clickbaity topic, she published books, she now is well connected and is invited in prestigious institutions. This also says a lot about the publishing industry. This means that the publishing industry is also subjected to digital media. If you look, for example, at another author, female author, such as Lauren Elkin, for example, whose book Art Monsters is very often in museum shops, that's a whole different story. And if you visit her website, it's really interesting how she presents herself. Rather than listing all her appearances, she just released a book about female voice, the use of female voice, Vocal Break, it is called. And she credits all the people who have interviewed her, written about her. She lifts everyone up with her. She's creating a community. If you get to her book, you buy her book in the museum shop, then maybe if you Google her name in the podcasting platform, then maybe you'll get to an interview of her or any podcast that mention her books. And maybe that way you can find new people and you can find different sorts of profiles of podcasters and podcasts. But it is difficult. I won't say that it's not difficult. That's not my point here. I'm even going to say that we are confusing as a society connection with savvy PR and quality with savvy PR, lists and infos, plucked from academic archives with critical thought. Culture is not a list of things. It's not listing interesting and thought-provoking creatives. It's more than that. It is a line of investigation that will withstand the tests of time and that will shift perspectives. And so takes are okay. I'm not against that. I also watch them on Instagram, that American collector. He's always having takes on everything. I find him amusing. Fine, great. But programs that explore, in-depth topics that are both classic or current, but that bring in like existential, interesting, important, joyful, and fun also, playful ways of engaging with the world are necessary to circulate culture. They're necessary to build it up and to make it meaningful and to make it something that stays with us, thinking of Agnes Martin's reflections earlier on. But once you do find them, what do you do? So I was watching a really interesting interview. They were talking about social media. It was interesting to see the different relationships that those actresses had with social media. So some of them were talking about memes, how they're memed, what meme of theirs they prefer, etc. Another one was saying that she was the manager and she created Diane Keaton's Instagram account. And that was fascinating. And she said she was blissful. She was always happy because she didn't read the comments. So total disengagement and a media, basically just a strategic operation here. And Keke Palmer said something really interesting. She said, well, social media has horrible aspects for sure. People say the most horrible things, but in hindsight, and she's a podcaster as well, she's a very lively and original thinker, and proving that, she said, I find it really useful because the people who really love what I do, who appreciate me as an artist, they follow me, they know where I am, I engage with them, I see them in events, and I know that they have my back and I have theirs. We are in constant engagement with each other, and it's a really nice tool to find your community. So what I thought was, if visual culture, visual arts, literature, critical thinking, theater, music, sound making, experimental art is really important to me, and the philosophical debates around them, and the sharing, and also the togetherness that they bring about, then I can't pretend that I'm not on those screens and that I'm not using them. I was using YouTube like a noodle. I was, watching a few interviews of some actors about some films I just watched, and of course, always looking for mainstream stuff because I thought nothing else was there. But you have the whole quarto conferences and seminars in there. But I also needed to produce it. But that was me. The biggest problem is the corporations, public, private, doesn't matter, that have replaced every human interaction with a screen or with a platform or a software or any kind of device that you just have to tap to get an answer that is never useful. Never. That's really what takes up time, what makes my life difficult, that affects my mental health. And you can sense from my tone that I'm not happy about it. I'm really not. My sense of things is that, reading, watching, exhibition going, listening, dancing along as well, participating, is the art experience that then is related by and expanded, potentially, hopefully, if critical thinking and talent and creative thinking is there, expanded. It is a huge sacrifice of time, of dedication, of putting your life on hold a little bit to invest in these shows, in these programs, in this content, and even in spaces, real spaces, to have a real space, to maintain a real space. The South London Gallery at the moment needs to gather £2 million to continue existing. It's very difficult to maintain culture. So my feeling, what I perceived, is that I have a role to play in it. So I have a role to play in commenting, in using the interactivity that is there to support this content. That's the really important thing. Then the digital hygiene is in the awareness of where your eyeballs go, of where your attention goes, and your intention goes as well. Everything is accessible nowadays, and therefore the intentionality needs to be there. I feel the need to do that, to reassess where my time goes, where my presence goes, and where my attention goes, and eventually what I'm financing, what I'm consuming, and whether I'm compensating the people who are giving me something, nourishing me. The interactivity, that community that Keke Palmer was talking about, is really what drew me here to podcasting. And it's really important to create it actively. And that just means, putting up in your stories an episode that you enjoyed, talking about this musician that you listened to in a small bar and you spotted their account somewhere on some platform where, other people can listen to their music, talking about them to your friends, putting it on your WhatsApp group chats. Culture is the way for us to build togetherness. Real creatives need digital media to be known. So we are in this conundrum of creatives who are not celebrities, who do not have a huge following, need digital media to spread the word, to put their shows out there, to put their voice out there, to put their work out. If our eyeballs and our attention is on celebrity culture that provides free content, very important and very interesting, then we are feeding the influencer type of culture, which is not to be completely berated. It's fine. It might have brought awareness to someone out there. I'm pretty sure that Katie Hessel has done a lot for visual art. It's great, but it's not the only kind of content out there. And it's a kind of content that you will consume because it's free. And then what happens is that you're creating a monolithic kind of visual arts culture, to speak only of visual arts, but it's the same in literature and elsewhere, that does not create the joy that Wordsworth was talking about and that Agnes Martin was talking about. This is not only about me, by the way. I'm not trying to create anything for Exhibitionistas Notes on Art or for Art Thinkosaurus, my Substack page, or Worlding, my online shop. It's for everyone. And that's what I did for myself. It did affect the way I consume things. There's magazines out there, Women Who Podcast magazine is one of them, where you can find content. You can find new podcasts to listen to. That's it for the digital hygiene segment and question. I hope you liked it, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Wonder. Maybe culture is shaping itself in a different way elsewhere. So one of the things that I can do is extend your Exhibitionistas experience. So this is the last thing that I want to talk to you about, which is, as I've said previously, the possibility of engaging with Exhibitionistas, engaging with me, but also my space, Worlding. If you're not in London or even in the UK, if anything, there's the possibility of watching the talks that we do. We post them there online. There was a really fascinating one about the artifacts in museums, what to do with them from the perspective of someone whose parents come from those places where these artifacts were looted, bought in not very legitimate conditions. Another thing that we will do very soon is we're going to open a bookshop that is going to work a bit differently. You'll see, but I'll announce it when the time comes. And we will also be developing online events. More on that later. We have time. Let's build this thing together. And in order to build this together, I really, really need your feedback. I really need you to tell me if you would like to join, for example, a reading club where we discuss a specific book. And the first book that I am going to be discussing is the one that I will cover in the next episode, The Work of Art in the Era of Mechanical Reproduction by Walter Benjamin, German theorist. It is one of the few philosophy or critical thinking books that has really pervaded and traversed a lot of fields of practice, of creativity, but also of technology. And I'm not sure that book is really understood. So to explain very quickly, it is the book where he develops the concept of aura. So saying that the work of art is a material thing, it's an object, and as an object, it exists in the place here and now, and you only get to experience it fully as a work of art. So the art experience will happen in front of it, with it, in its presence, because it has a sort of an aura, and that aura is not transmissible when the object is photographed, filmed, described, etc. So, platicar, as I said in the beginning, remember this Mexican word that means the art of conversation, and experiencing are two very different things. And from one to the other, what we lose in regards to the art object is the aura. And this text is often quoted, and I decided to work on it because I came across the third quote in a week in the text that I was reading as Benjamin denouncing the loss of the aura of the art object and of art in general, and the sort of decay of culture and the death of society and the death of art, which is not what he says. There's a part of the book, of the text, it's a very small text, there's a part of it that considers that possibility. But this book is not a closed book. It's not a diagnosis. It's a sort of a tutorial, almost, if we want to speak in digital terms. Apologies for that. Crude language, I know, terrible. So though that's one of the things that I'm thinking of doing, sort of a reading online and in the space at Welding as a 1 per month activity that we can do together. So let me know if you're interested, what you'd like to do, if you have other ideas. Artists out there, I was asked by 1 or 2 artists about artist mentorships. I don't know if I see myself as a mentor, but I would love to have sessions where artists talk about their worries, their strategies, their projects. As a curator, that's what I do. And maybe that's also a possibility. So artists out there who listen to the podcast, let me know if this is something that might interest you. I'm still building it. The thing that is finished is the structure of the episode. And so, wrapping up, thank you so much for sticking around. Thank you for your curiosity. Thank you for the art of wonderment that you're showing. Finally, Brainstorm in a Teacup, which is an unrelated thought at the end of each episode. In Portugal, a lot of the stories that I remember being told as a child started with once upon a time when the animals still knew how to talk. No tempo em que os animais ainda falavam, era uma vez. I'm not sure I followed the story as attentively as I delighted myself with the idea that animals had reached an enlightenment so perfect that they didn't need words anymore. When I chat with my catpanions, they're kind enough to utter a few words, but the depth of our communication is entirely telepathic. Thank you for sticking around. Have a great one. Be an exhibitionista. Visit exhibitions. Let me live vicariously through you and tell me about them. Leave some comments in there. Write me an email. And who knows, maybe I'll read some of your texts. They can become a brainstorm in a teacup, maybe. Maybe I can have guests in this little segment. Anyway, send me a voice message. Tell me about your experiences. Leave comments. Follow, subscribe. Don't forget to donate. That would be really lovely. That's what makes it possible to be here. That's what sustains this podcast. So if you enjoy it, if you're excited about what's going to happen in a fortnight, which is continuing with a polished format, a more streamlined experience for you, but still the same delirious wandering content, do the deed. There's a link in the show's notes. On Substack, you can also support us. There's many ways for you to do it. You can go on our website. There's a donating page over there. So do support us. Leave comments. Contact me. Tell me what you want. Tell me what you need. And I'll see what I can do about it. All right. Have a good one. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye. See you in 2 weeks. Or no, you'll see me or you will hear me. Anyway, we'll be in each other's presence very soon. Bye-bye. Take care.